Ever wondered what marriage drama looked like before social media? Did medieval couples fight over who forgot to feed the castle goats, or who left the drawbridge down? While we stress about text messages and Instagram likes, medieval couples had their own wild relationship problems that make modern squabbles seem downright boring. Number 10. The case of the reluctant bride who bit off her husband's testicles. Can you imagine a wedding night gone so wrong that it ends in bodily mutilation? In 14th century France, a young noblewoman named Isabi was forced to marry an elderly lord at least 40 years her senior. Historical court records from the region of Normandy reveal that on their wedding night, the bride was so unwilling that when her new husband attempted to consummate the marriage, she reportedly bit off part of his genitals. The ensuing legal battle became notorious throughout the French countryside. The husband's family demanded justice, claiming she had deliberately maimed him to render him incapable of producing heirs, thereby keeping his fortune for herself. Isabeau's defense was simple. She had been forced into the marriage against her will and had repeatedly expressed her unwillingness to become intimate. What makes this case so fascinating is the court's decision. Rather than punishing the young woman harshly, as might be expected, the local ecclesiastical court actually granted her an annulment. The judges reasoned that since the marriage had been forced upon her, and because of the extreme physical altercation, the union had never truly been consummated, and therefore could be dissolved. The elderly lord lived the remainder of his days in pain and humiliation, while Isabeau eventually remarried to a much younger man, and reportedly lived quite happily thereafter. The case became so notorious it was even referenced in several satirical poems of the era, using metaphors involving wolves and sheep that were unmistakably about this unusual marital dispute. Number 9. The husband who sued because his wife wouldn't stop talking. Would you take your spouse to court for talking too much? In 1375, a merchant from York named Thomas de Hutton did exactly that. According to court records preserved in the York Minster Library, Thomas brought his wife Margaret before an ecclesiastical court on charges of excessive verbal torment. The detailed complaint stated that Margaret would talk incessantly, from sunrise to sunset, preventing Thomas from conducting his business affairs and causing him grievous mental anguish. He claimed she followed him around their home, to the market, and even to guild meetings, constantly chattering about household matters, neighborhood gossip, and complaints about his family. The court took this case surprisingly seriously. Several neighbors testified that Margaret's talking could indeed be heard through the walls of adjacent houses, and that she was known throughout the neighborhood for her inability to remain silent for more than a few minutes at a time. In a twist that reveals much about medieval gender dynamics, the court ordered Margaret to wear a special metal bridle device known as a scold's bridle for 2 hours each day. This cruel contraption fit over the head and had a metal piece that held down the tongue, physically preventing speech. Records indicate that Margaret was made to wear this in the town square for 6 consecutive Sundays. The aftermath of this unusual punishment provides an interesting coda. Within a year, Thomas himself was brought to court by town officials for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. Some historians speculate this may have been his way of coping with the sudden silence at home, while others have suggested the community may have turned against him for his harsh treatment of Margaret. Number 8. The wife who exchanged her husband for a better model. Think spouse swapping is a modern concept? Think again. One of the most scandalous marital disputes of medieval England occurred in 1433 when Alice Bradwell of Suffolk essentially traded her husband for another man, with written documentation to prove it. Court records show that Alice had been married to William Bradwell, a tanner by trade, for 7 years. Their marriage was reportedly filled with arguments over William's drinking and gambling habits. The situation reached a breaking point when William lost a substantial sum of money that had been set aside for taxes. What happened next was extraordinary for the time. Alice struck a deal with Thomas Hodges, a local carpenter who had long admired her. Thomas agreed to pay off William's debts if William would agree to step aside and allow Thomas to marry Alice. Even more surprisingly, William agreed, and the three of them drew up a contract actually written by a local scribe and witnessed by the parish priest, who later claimed he'd been misled about the document's contents. When local authorities discovered this arrangement, all three participants were brought before an ecclesiastical court. The church was horrified by this casual treatment of the marriage sacrament. William and Alice were ordered to remain together as husband and wife, while Thomas was fined heavily and required to perform public penance. What makes this case particularly fascinating is Alice's testimony. Court transcripts reveal, she argued eloquently, that since her husband had been willing to sell her, he had already broken his marriage vows to cherish and protect her. She even cited biblical passages suggesting that a husband who fails to provide for his family hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Despite her arguments, the church maintained the sanctity of the original marriage. However, historical records show that within 2 years, William had died under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and Alice did indeed marry Thomas shortly thereafter. Number 7. The man who claimed his wife was actually a demon. Can you imagine accusing your spouse of being a literal demon? In 1459, a French nobleman named Etienne Delacroix brought exactly this charge against his wife of 3 years, Claude. The case was heard in a specialized ecclesiastical court in Toulouse that dealt with matters of potential heresy and witchcraft. Etienne testified that he had witnessed Claude transform physically during the night, claiming her eyes glowed red and that she spoke in unknown languages. He further alleged that food would spoil in her presence and that livestock had died mysteriously since their marriage. Claude, who came from a wealthy merchant family, vigorously defended herself. She brought witnesses who testified to her pious nature and regular church attendance. More significantly, she countered that Etienne had substantial gambling debts and stood to gain control of her considerable dowry if she were convicted of being a demon. The court proceedings lasted nearly 6 months, with testimony from over 40 witnesses, including several priests who had performed exorcisms in the couple's home at Etienne's request. Medical experts of the time, primarily monks with knowledge of herbalism, examined Claude and found no evidence of demonic possession. What makes this case particularly fascinating was the court's eventual ruling. Rather than dismissing the case outright, the judges ordered a peculiar test. Claude was required to recite the Lord's Prayer while standing in the cathedral holding blessed objects. When she completed this task without any adverse effects, demons were believed to be unable to recite holy texts or touch blessed items. The case was dismissed. The aftermath proved more fascinating than the trial itself. Etienne was not only humiliated, but also required to pay substantial compensation to Claude and her family for defamation. Historical records indicate that Claude subsequently separated from Etienne and joined a convent, where she eventually became an abbess. Meanwhile, Etienne's financial and social standing collapsed, and he died in poverty several years later, leading to local rumors that perhaps he had been the one cursed all along. Number 6. The royal wedding night that launched a diplomatic crisis. How could one unconsummated royal marriage nearly lead to war? In 1477, Archduchess Mary of Burgundy married Maximilian I of Habsburg in what was supposed to be a strategic alliance between their powerful families. The marriage ceremony went smoothly. But what happened, or rather didn't happen, on their wedding night created an international incident that lasted for months. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Habsburg archives, Maximilian was unable to consummate the marriage. After 3 nights of failed attempts, Mary's ladies-in-waiting reported the situation to her father's advisors, who immediately sent urgent messages to Burgundy. The Burgundian court was furious, interpreting this as a deliberate insult to their royal house. They dispatched physicians to examine Maximilian, which the Habsburg court considered a profound humiliation of their future emperor. Maximilian's father, Emperor Frederick III, threatened to withdraw crucial military support from Burgundy, which was then engaged in territorial disputes with France. As the diplomatic crisis escalated, Pope Sixtus IV became involved as mediator. Church records indicate that priests and medical experts from both courts were consulted about whether the marriage could be considered valid without consummation, and whether divine intervention might be required to resolve the impediment. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how it was ultimately resolved. After weeks of tension, Mary herself wrote letters to both courts, declaring that the marriage had finally been consummated successfully. Whether this was true or a diplomatic fiction remains debated by historians. Interestingly, the couple did eventually produce children, with their first child born approximately 2 years after the wedding. The entire episode reveals how deeply personal aspects of royal marriages were intertwined with international politics. Even bedroom matters could become affairs of state when they involved royal succession and alliance building between powerful families. The marriage ultimately proved successful both personally and politically, though Mary died young in a hunting accident, leaving Maximilian bereaved but in control of her vast territories. Number 5. The wife who sued for divorce because her husband was too boring. Is being boring grounds for divorce? One medieval woman certainly thought so. In 1433, a remarkable case came before the Ecclesiastical Court of Canterbury involving Marjorie de Reims, who sought an annulment of her marriage to Thomas de Reims on the unusual grounds that he was intolerably dull. Court records show that Marjorie, who came from a family of prosperous wool merchants, had been married to Thomas for just over 2 years. In her petition, she claimed that he never engaged in conversation beyond commenting on the weather, refused to participate in any social gatherings or festivities, and spent every evening silently whittling wooden figures which he arranged around their home. What made this case particularly unusual was Marjorie's argument. Rather than claiming cruelty or adultery, more common grounds for medieval marriage dissolution, she argued that Thomas's extreme dullness constituted a form of spiritual cruelty that was damaging her mental well-being. She claimed to be suffering from melancholy and wasting as a result of their joyless household. Thomas's defense was equally remarkable. Court transcripts show he argued that a husband was not obligated to be entertaining only to provide materially and remain faithful, both duties he had fulfilled. He further testified that Marjorie's expectations had been unreasonable from the start, as she had apparently believed he would transform from a quiet craftsman into a courtly and poetic figure after their wedding. The court ultimately ruled against Marjorie, upholding the marriage. However, the judge did issue an unusual compromise, ordering Thomas to host at least 4 feasts per year at their home and to accompany Marjorie to church festivals. Historical records indicate the couple remained unhappily married until Thomas's death about 7 years later, after which Marjorie apparently remarried quite quickly to a local musician known for his storytelling abilities. Number 4. The husband who believed his wife had been replaced by an identical impostor. Could you be convinced your spouse had been replaced by a look-alike? In 1382, a wealthy merchant from Florence named Giovanni Arnolfini became convinced that his wife Giovanna had been kidnapped and replaced with an identical-looking impostor. This bizarre case was documented in detail because it eventually involved both civil authorities and church officials. According to court testimony, Giovanni returned from a 3-month trading journey to find what he claimed was a subtle but unmistakable change in his wife. Though she looked identical, he insisted that small behavioral differences, the way she prepared certain dishes, her handwriting, even the sound of her footsteps, revealed she was not his true wife. Giovanna, understandably distressed by these accusations, maintained she was indeed herself, and suggested that her husband's long journey at sea had affected his mind. She brought forward numerous witnesses, including her own family members, who testified that she was genuinely Giovanna Arnolfini. The case grew increasingly complicated when Giovanni produced letters supposedly written by the real Giovanna that he claimed had been secretly delivered to him, suggesting she was being held captive somewhere in the city. Handwriting experts of the time, typically monks and notaries, were consulted and concluded that the letters had indeed been written by Giovanna, or someone who could perfectly mimic her writing. Church authorities became involved when Giovanni refused to live with or support the impostor. The local bishop ordered an investigation that included interviewing childhood friends of Giovanna, examining identifying marks on her body that had been documented in her dowry agreement, and even a questioning under oath where she was asked intimate details only the real Giovanna would know. After months of investigation, the ecclesiastical court concluded that no substitution had occurred and the woman was indeed Giovanni's lawful wife. They suggested Giovanni was suffering from a condition they called phantasma of the mind, what modern psychiatrists might identify as Capgras delusion, a disorder in which someone believes a person close to them has been replaced by an identical-looking impostor. The aftermath of this case was particularly poignant. Historical records show Giovanni was eventually convinced of his error after suffering a high fever, during which he claimed to have had a vision of Saint Catherine of Siena, who revealed to him that his suspicions had been planted by a demon jealous of his happy marriage. The couple reconciled and actually commissioned a famous portrait together, which some art historians believe may have been painted by Anne van Eyck during a visit to Italy, as a testament to their renewed marriage vows. Number 3. The wife who haunted her husband after death. Can marital disputes continue beyond the grave? According to records from 15th century England, one particularly vengeful wife made sure hers did. In 1437, a landowner from Norfolk named Sir Ralph Harbord found himself in a most unusual ecclesiastical court case, claiming his deceased wife, Agnes, was haunting him specifically to continue their marital arguments. The detailed court documents preserved in the Norwich Cathedral archives show that Ralph testified under oath that Agnes's ghost appeared regularly in their manor house, moving objects, slamming doors, and most disturbingly whispering dictated sleep. What makes this case particularly fascinating is that Ralph wasn't trying to exorcise the ghost. Instead, he was petitioning the church to grant a posthumous annulment of their marriage, arguing that the continued haunting proved their marital bond had been somehow improper or cursed. Agnes had died approximately 8 months earlier from a fever, and, according to household servants who testified, the couple had argued bitterly in the weeks before her death over Ralph's gambling debts and his attention to a young widow in the neighboring estate. The church officials took this case surprisingly seriously, dispatching 3 priests to perform investigations at the manor house. Their reports, still preserved in church records, noted several unexplained phenomena, including a dramatic temperature drop in the master bedroom and the mysterious appearance of written messages that reportedly matched Agnes's handwriting. The court ultimately denied Ralph's request for an annulment, ruling that death had already severed the marriage bond. However, in a fascinating compromise, they ordered a series of 30 requiem masses to be said for Agnes's soul, the cost to be paid by Ralph. They also required him to fulfill several promises he had allegedly made to Agnes before her death, including establishing a small almshouse for widows in the parish. Local records indicate that after these obligations were fulfilled, the haunting apparently ceased. Ralph eventually remarried, though servants reported he would never enter certain rooms in the manor house alone, and maintained the unusual habit of apologizing aloud to empty rooms before making any significant household decisions. Number 2. The couple who couldn't agree if they were actually married. Did we get married or not? This seemingly straightforward question led to one of the most complex legal battles of medieval France. In 1412, a merchant named Jacques Fournier and a noblewoman named Isabelle de Montfort found themselves in a bitter dispute over whether they were legally married at all. According to court documents preserved in the judicial archives of Paris, Jacques claimed they had exchanged marriage vows privately in the presence of 2 witnesses, which was legally binding under certain circumstances in medieval law, followed by living together as husband and wife for nearly 7 months. Isabelle, however, insisted that while they had discussed marriage, no formal vows had ever been exchanged, and she had merely allowed him extended hospitality while he conducted business in the region. The case became extraordinarily complicated because both parties produced witnesses supporting their version of events. Jacques presented 2 friends who testified they had witnessed a simple but legally valid exchange of consent. Isabelle countered with servants who swore that the couple had maintained separate sleeping arrangements, and that Jacques had always been introduced to visitors as a family friend. What elevated this case beyond a simple he said, she said dispute was the social and financial stakes involved. Isabelle came from minor nobility and possessed significant property, while Jacques was a successful but common-born merchant. If their marriage was recognized, Jacques would gain control over Isabelle's estate. If not, he would have no claim to her wealth. The ecclesiastical court that heard the case took testimony from over 20 witnesses and deliberated for nearly 4 months. Particularly fascinating was the detailed examination of exactly what words had allegedly been spoken during the supposed marriage ceremony, as medieval canon law distinguished between words of future intent, "I will marry you," versus present consent, "I do marry you now." In a surprising twist, while the case was still pending, Isabelle secretly married a local nobleman, effectively forcing the court's hand. The judges ultimately ruled that insufficient evidence existed to prove a valid marriage had occurred between Isabelle and Jacques Perrat. However, they also ordered Isabelle to pay Jacques significant compensation for injury to reputation and expectation. Historical records indicate that Jacques used this settlement to establish a highly successful trading company, eventually becoming wealthier than Isabelle. Meanwhile, Isabelle's hasty second marriage proved unhappy, and local chronicles mention that she often referred to it as her penance for imprudence. Number 1. The royal husband who rejected his bride because she was too beautiful. Could someone be too attractive for marriage? In one of history's most ironic marital disputes, King Charles VI of France initially refused to consummate his marriage to Isabi of Bavaria in 1385 because he claimed she was inappropriately beautiful. This bizarre situation is well documented in royal chronicles and diplomatic correspondence. The marriage had been arranged, as was customary for royal unions, without the couple having met. When 17-year-old Charles first saw his 14-year-old bride, he was reportedly so overwhelmed by her beauty that he became convinced she was either a witch who had enhanced her appearance through magic, or that a substitution had occurred and he was being tricked into marrying a princess. Court records indicate that Charles refused to be alone with Isabi for nearly 3 weeks after their wedding ceremony, demanding that church officials investigate whether supernatural forces were involved in her appearance. Multiple priests were called to examine the young queen for signs of witchcraft, while diplomatic envoys were hurriedly dispatched to Bavaria to verify her identity. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how it was resolved. Historical accounts describe how the king's uncle, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, orchestrated an elaborate ruse. He arranged for Charles to spy on Isabi through a hidden opening while she was in her chambers, unaware she was being observed. Seeing her in this unguarded state, with the same remarkable beauty but behaving in an ordinary manner, apparently convinced Charles that she was genuine. The marriage was finally consummated, and the couple went on to have 12 children together. Ironically, their marriage became notorious for different reasons. In later years, Charles developed mental illness that included periods where he believed he was made of glass or didn't recognize Isabeau at all. Meanwhile, Isabeau gained significant political power during her husband's periods of incapacity, leading to rumors about her relationships with other courtiers. The initial dispute over Isabeau's excessive beauty became a strangely prophetic beginning to what historians consider one of the most tumultuous royal marriages of medieval France. Their marital difficulties would eventually have far-reaching political consequences, contributing to the unstable governance of France during a critical period of the 100 Years' War. Ever wondered what happens when even kings and queens can't figure out their marriage problems? Did medieval couples really have it worse than we do now? Or are human relationships just eternally complicated no matter what century we're living in?